All right. Well, on to our last session for the day. It is our very own Peter Neubauer, and he is going to talk about packet radio and the Apple II. And he is continuing his 2020 overview of amateur radio and the Apple II. And Peter's going to dig into and give us details on packet radio networking. So let's run the video.
Hello, I'm Peter Neubauer. Today I'm going to talk about amateur packet radio in the Apple II. That is, how to connect an Apple II to an amateur radio and perform digital computer networking entirely over the air with the radio waves. This is a continuation of my 2020 KansasFest presentation. The 2020 presentation gave an overview of amateur radio in the Apple II. This presentation is different, though. We're digging into a particular method of operation called packet radio, and it is not necessary to have seen the 2020 presentation to follow along today. So I'll start off with an overview of what packet radio is, why people created it. There's an important historical context surrounding the creation and significance of packet radio. I'll talk a bit about how packet radio works, how to set this system up with your Apple II, and then we'll wrap up with a demonstration and Q&A. So the photograph that you see here is my Apple II GS set up for packet radio. I'll talk a bit more about what the pieces are and how you potentially create this yourself. To really understand the significance of packet radio, you need to step back to telecommunications in the 1980s. Compared to today, telecommunications was much more difficult and much more expensive. Telecommunication in the 1980s and even the 1990s really meant buying a modem, buying a telephone line, and usually long distance charges. The cost of those long distance charges and the telephone line, the recurring costs were significant. And many people had a dream of free wireless digital communication. That is the ability to do telecommunications without being tethered to a telephone line and the costs that go with that. Amateur radio enthusiasts saw an opportunity. The amateur radio enthusiasts already had the radios and the antennas. Many of them also had personal computers. Packet radio was born out of the desire to connect their computers to their radios and use that as a essentially free medium for global digital communications. So the term packet and packet radio just refers to the general concept of subdividing digital communications into small pieces. And this facilitates channel sharing, that is having multiple computers communicating over the same frequency, the same channel, if you will. It also supports error correction such that a single error does not require retransmission of all the digital data. This is the foundation of all modern and even not so modern computer networking, but it was novel to bring this in the early 1980s to amateur radio. When we say amateur packet radio, it's somewhat of a vague term, especially if you have a computer networking background. Within the amateur community, this typically refers to using a networking protocol called AX.25. AX.25 is derived from a earlier networking protocol called X25 from IBM. This is incidentally also the same foundation used within Local Talk and Apple Talk. Historically, AX25 is a 1200 baud channel. Nowadays, it's pretty slow, but again, in the early 80s, 1200 baud was pretty reasonable if you're coming from a modem background. Since then, there have, of course, been many other updates, efforts to increase the speed, adopt different protocols than AX25. And however, the historic AX25 at 1200 baud still remains the most commonly used. It's fast enough for most situations, and it does not require a special radio. Faster speeds often do require special radios or modified radios, and it's easy to get started. Packet radio is still in use today. Activity varies by the region, though. Locally, I don't have a whole lot of interesting packet radio traffic. So for today's demonstration, I've actually set up a whole separate Raspberry Pi so that my Apple II can communicate wirelessly to the Pi. However, depending on where you live, you may well find that there's a strong network of packet activity. Uh, Packet radio activity today is nothing like it was in the 80s. Packet radio exploded throughout the 80s. There was a lot of interest among amateurs and computer users because, again, there weren't a lot of other good telecommunications options. Today, of course, that's different, but there's still a strong community of people continuing to use the traditional 1200 watt AX25 as well as developing new innovations. So let's talk a little more about the concrete details of connecting your Apple II to your radio. First, an amateur radio operator is a licensed service. You will need a license. Typically, the entry level in the US is called the technician license is adequate, and you can find a local amateur radio club or various internet sources to help you study for that test. The introductory test is not all that difficult. It's mostly about regulations to avoid unwanted interference. Next, obviously, you need a radio and antenna. You do not need a special radio for at least the 1200 baud packet radio we're talking about today. There are many options for radios, both radios that are currently on the market as well as historic or used radios. Only requirement is that the radio operate within the range of frequencies that you want to use and you're also licensed for. Typically, its 1200 baud packet is within the 2 meter band, so that's around 144 megahertz. Those radios are widely available and relatively inexpensive. You also need a way to get audio into and out of the radio. Most radios have this. Most radios will have a microphone connection for getting audio in and a speaker connection for getting audio out. There is no standard for this connection. The closest we can get is what's often called a data port. It's a round DIN port on the back of a radio. If you have a choice, that's a great place to start. It's the most convenient way, the closest to a standard way of connecting to a radio that exists today. If not, many of the manuals for the radios, historic books on packet radio, as well as internet searches can turn up wiring diagrams for your radio. Most likely you will need to buy or build a custom cable to connect to your radio. Fortunately, it's not all that difficult, but it does take a little bit of time. Moving to the left on the diagram, what packet radio interfaces to your radio through audio frequency signals. So you can actually listen to the packet radio signals, and they sound pretty similar to the same audio tones that you've heard out of a modem. Fortunately, this makes the interfacing to the radio easy. As I said, most radios already have connections for these speaker and microphone signals. The next piece is what's called a terminal node controller. Now, if we're trying to do packet radio on a modern computer, we'll connect the radio typically to a USB sound card, plug it right into your modern computer, and then everything else happens in software. However, the Apple II is not fast enough to be able to do that. To pull off packet radio, first of all, we need signal processing capabilities. That is the ability to turn the audio frequency signals coming from the radio into data, and then data back into audio frequency signals. That's the modulation, demodulation, or the modem piece. Additionally, we need a microcomputer to implement this AX25 networking stack. Um, Again, with a modern computer, that's easy. With the Apple II, it's simply not fast enough by itself to pull that all off. In general, personal computers were not fast enough to do all that entirely in software until the late 90s. So the terminal node controller is a box of hardware, and there's many different vendors available that incorporates the analog electronics to the modulation and demodulation, and a small purpose-built computer. The Z80 microprocessor was popular for this purpose-built computer. Other microprocessors were used. Some of the first terminal node controllers use a 6809. Um, And then after the Z80, some moved on to the 68HC11 as a method of reducing cost and size of these devices. And still later, TNCs moved on to the 68,000 processor. On the analog side, the earliest TNCs have literally a stack of op amps inside. But as technology progressed, we got application-specific integrated circuits to simplify and cost reduce, and then eventually digital signal processors before finally desktop computers were able to catch up and take that over. The TNC typically interfaces to the computer via standard RS-232 serial port. Then finally, on the left-hand side, we need our computer. Any Apple II computer with a serial port will do the job. I'd recommend an 80 column card simply because there's a lot of text, but that's optional. Uh, the built-in serial ports on a 2C, 2C plus, or GS work equally well. On the software side on the Apple II, you can use a standard terminal program such as a ProTerm. However, that's not necessary. However, there's purpose-built software that does a better job. In other words, a standard terminal program works, but there's additional features that make packet radio easier, and we'll see some of that in a moment. So this is my Apple II GS setup. On the right-hand side, I have a Apple II GS with a CFFA 3000 and Apple Squeezer. You don't need a GS, you don't need an accelerator, you don't need a CFFA. Basic 5 1/4 inch disc is more than adequate. I simply use this because it's what I had on my desk, and I wanted to use the Apple Squeezer's HDMI output for video capture. On the left-hand side, we see the amateur radio pieces. There's a serial cable going from the modem port on the back of the GS over to the TNC. That's the black box. I have the AEA model PK232 MBX, which is a fairly popular, widely available used model of TNC. There are many TNCs out there. The period packet radio books often have a summary of some of the different models. Really, any model of TNC with a serial port will do the job. Uh, I take a look at what's available used locally. The TNCs are usually not particularly desirable, and therefore they're usually available relatively inexpensively. They're also available widely on eBay. The TNC then connects to the radio on the top. There's a custom-built cable that goes from the back of the TNC up to the radio. And then finally, the radio connects to an antenna. The antenna is outside this picture, however. For the purposes of this demonstration, I've also set up an entirely separate Raspberry Pi. On the bottom, you see the Raspberry Pi. Stacked on top of that is a sound card and a small LCD. In the back, we see another radio, which is attached to another antenna. There are no wires between the Raspberry Pi and the radio and the Apple II side, so everything is done wirelessly. Most likely with this setup, I could move the Apple II on the order of 10 to 20 miles away, and depending on antennas and terrain and what have you, most likely would also be able to work. Here's another picture of that Raspberry Pi. Gives you a little broader view. And now we are ready to jump over to the live demo on the Apple II. For this, I'm going to use software called Apple Packet Radio. That is available out there at the link that's listed below. I was aware of Apple Packet Radio for several years. I knew about it in 2020, and then last year at KansasFest, I came across a floppy disk titled Apple Packet Radio, and that reminded me of that. So I'm actually using a copy of that disk with this Apple Packet Radio or APR shareware. So right now I'm going to jump over to a video capture from my 2GS. And I'm going to step out of frame so I can get to the keyboard that's at the other end of the desk. This is the splash screen from APR. I'll hit enter, and here we go. So now we are connected to the TNC. The TNC has sent us a little bit of text. Right now I have what's called monitor mode on, and the TNC will print out any data that it receives. So in this case, we most recently received that it's received a broadcast from call sign KD0QXJ-4, which is my Raspberry Pi that's about 15 feet away. This is where we need to know the command set unique to the TNC. There is unfortunately no universally standard command set. You will need the manual matching up with your with your TNC. Fortunately, there's enough similarity that whatever commands you're using with your particular TNC will likely be very similar to what I have here. First thing we notice is what's called a split terminal. This is a very useful feature compared to a traditional serial terminal that APR offers. So as I type, the text I type will show up at the bottom underneath the horizontal bar, and then the text I type in will be echoed in the top pane, as well as any incoming data from the TNC. This is helpful because unlike a telephone modem that gives you a point-to-point connection between two stations only, the radio can potentially connect to many different stations at the same time. So I could receive transmissions from another station in the middle of typing. So splitting the terminal up into these two pieces allows me to continue my typing uninterrupted while still monitoring any incoming traffic. So first thing I'm going to do is issue a connect command. So that's C, and then I'll enter the call sign I want to connect to. I happen to know it's KD0QXJ-4, and it takes a moment for the connection to kick off. Okay, I am now connected, and the remote station, in this case my Raspberry Pi, is sending out a menu. The menu is entirely customizable over on the remote station. Different nodes, as they're called, run different software, offer different features. Many offer the ability to chat or talk with other simultaneously connected stations. AX25 offers a combination of connected and disconnected modes of communication. Right now, we're using that connected mode of communication. So the TNC is taking care of sending a packet of information, getting an acknowledgement from the remote station, then if necessary, detecting errors and retransmitting. And that all of that happens transparent to me as the end user. It's very similar to BBS experience. In this case, I am going to play Zork. Why not? And there we go. So Zork is running over on my Raspberry Pi. Uh, Other software could run there. Again, it's up to the person who owns and runs the remote stations to decide which services they want to offer. And in this case, this is running a software package called DigiPi, which includes, among other things, Zork. So I could continue to use this, and I'm not very familiar with Zork 1. I don't know if this will work, but we'll demo it. All right, made a small bit of progress, but I think that's enough Zork for the moment. Uh, there are often large networks of packet radio nodes. So it's also possible to relay or digipeat traffic through nodes. So if I can't reach another station directly, I could send my packets through multiple other stations. With with the basic AX25 implementation, I need to know that route. There are other pieces of software that came later and build on top of AX25 and provide some of the automatic routing, such as ROSE and NetRound. But we're not using that here. We're making a direct connection to the end station. And I think I remember the command to quit, and I did pretty poorly, but that's okay. Now I can go back to the mini system, and I could continue. I could then connect to additional nodes. I could use one of the other services. This particular node also offers a mailbox capability, so I could leave a message for another operator to connect to in the future. So that wraps up my demo for today. I think with the information I've given you, you can get started, potentially set up your own packet radio connection, either with an Apple II or something else. And I welcome questions. Feel free to reach out to me if you want advice on setting this up or choosing your TNC. And thank you for your time.
Well, thanks, Peter. That was a very, very interesting talk. It was a lot of chatter, a lot of questions here. So we have about 7 minutes or so to answer questions. Hopefully, there'll be enough time.
Okay, thank you. And I'm always happy to follow up on Discord later.
Yep. So Ron's question is, what sort of costs are people looking at getting involved? Should they buy new or used equipment, and what's the best place to start?
For the TNC, I recommend you use. TNCs are now obsolete, but there's many available inexpensively either on eBay or sometimes at local ham radio swap meets. At eBay prices, you can get a good TNC for under $50. That's the swap meet, $5, $10. Partially depends on the model and partially depends on luck. On the side of the radio, you don't need anything special. A radio like this, it's $20 on Amazon. It's got the radio, it's got the microphone and speaker connections, and even comes with an antenna. Of course, better radios are more expensive, but those aren't necessary to get started.
And you don't need a license, right?
You
Or do
do
you?
need a license to transmit. You can listen all you
Okay.
want.
Okay.
The license itself doesn't cost anything. However, you might need a book to study or some other
Pass
resources.
some
And there's
tests.
various online test resources. Yeah.
Okay. So David asked maybe a comment here. Love the combination of interests. Peter, I have a great fondness for classic radio programming and classic radio hobbies, as well as the Apple II. Thanks.
Yeah, I find I have limited hardware time, limited hobby time, so I like to combine different hobbies into one. I'm also looking at building a portable packet radio setup because I also enjoy hiking, so want to take it along.
All right. Jonathan asked, what bands do operators tend to use for packet radio?
Most packet radio is on the 2 meter band. That's around 144 megahertz. Those radios are relatively inexpensive, such as this. There is packet radio activity in other bands, such as the 70 centimeter band, as well as in the HF bands. For that, you'll likely need a different radio, different antenna, likely a bit more expensive. But there's a lot less activity there.
All right. Do you know about the Computer and Radio Museum at Camp Evans, New Jersey, on the New Jersey shore? It was once a terminal point of transatlantic cable. This is from Jim.
That's fascinating. I did not know about it until I read this. Thank you for sharing.
It was awesome. I've been there, and it's just unbelievable. How large or complex of an antenna is needed to credibly use packet radio? This is from Dan.
It depends on how far you want to go. An antenna like this is, is more than adequate. I have a larger antenna on my roof. It's a quarter wave antenna, but that's overkill for what I've been doing today.
So just the rubber ducky is fine.
This will get you going, yes.
Okay. How active is packet radio these days? I'm likely to encounter other stations if I live in a reasonably sized city. Another question from Jonathan.
Yeah, it varies widely. Um, some areas do have active traditional packet radio amateurs, but other areas don't. Packet radio is also used for some other applications. There is a email over radio service called WinLink, which is a fascinating and fantastic service, but I'm more interested in the traditional uses of packet radio. There's also another service out there called APRS, which is frequently used for transmitting positional and tactical awareness type of data. That's probably the biggest modern use of packet radio. You can monitor that with your traditional TNC.
I'm into Meshtastic. Can I do packet radio on LoRa?
I don't know. I've never tried that. I know there's a lot of different areas of experimentation with packet radio. Even well throughout the 90s, there's a lot of interest in faster methods of communication. More recently, that continued leveraging some of the more modern digital signal processing techniques and mesh radio techniques. I don't know specifically about LoRa, so if you find out, please let me know.
So Brian asked, is this essentially like a BBS but via radio?
Packet radio is computer networking over a radio, and there's different things you can use that for. You can do a keyboard to keyboard chat with nothing else in between. You can also build a BBS. You can have file downloads, file transfer capabilities. You can have messaging capabilities, games such as you saw with my demonstration. So it can be used for BBS. It can be used as a general purpose computer network as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I knew an engineer back in the 80s, maybe late 80s, had an Apple II, and he was decoding, I think he was using the TRRS signals to decode weather maps and print them out on his image writer.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah. There's a lot of other activity out there on amateur radio. This presentation was specifically about packet. Something else that's fun to do is decode slow scan television signals coming from the International Space Station. Typically, every couple of months, there's a broadcast, and because it's receive only, there's no license. I haven't figured out how to do that on my Apple II yet.
Interesting. All right. Can aviation handsets be used for this? This is Ed.
It depends on the frequency coverage of your aviation handset. You will, assuming it covers the right frequencies, you will be able to receive packet radio, but transmitting packet radio is going to require something licensed for, or at least modified for transmission in the right band. So a aviation handset, most likely, or at least not legally, won't be able to transmit on the hand bands.
What about using a scanner like this, Peter? But there, like the Radio Shack scanners that you used to buy back in the day to listen to the police calls and fire calls and cellular phone when it wasn't encrypted.
Yeah, it's great for receiving.
Okay.
And all the TNCs have a monitor mode. They'll print out all the traffic that they receive. Don't need a license, don't need much of antenna, and you hopefully already have that radio. So that can be a good way to get started.
Well, I think we're all out of questions and we're just about out of, well, we are out of time here now. So thank you. That was a awesome presentation.
Thank you. Appreciate the time. I'll be available later.